The cowboy fought a masked Apache warrior and froze when the helmet fell. It was a woman. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Out on the harsh plains of the American West, where the horizon stretched for miles in every direction, a lone cowboy named Jack Brody made his living on the fringes of civilization. His days were spent tending cattle, mending fences, and doing what was necessary to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent to the struggles of men like him. Jack had built a life of solitude, preferring the quiet company of his horses and the endless sky above. He had his routine, and it was simple, no distractions, no surprises. But all that changed on one fateful day when a masked Apache warrior appeared on his land. The warrior was like none Jack had ever encountered before. Dressed in dark, weathered leather, with intricate war paint covering his face and arms, the man stood tall and powerful, exuding an aura of danger. He was fast and fierce, his movements swift and precise as he charged at Jack with a wild fury that seemed to come from some deep, untold place. Jack had no time to think. Instinct took over as he drew his gun and met the warrior head-on. The two clashed in the dust, their struggle violent and raw. Jack could feel the intensity in the air, the raw force of the warrior's blows, but there was something different about this fight, something that made him pause for just a moment. The warrior's speed and precision were almost unnatural, and though Jack was quick on his feet, he couldn't help but wonder how this man had become so skilled. They fought for what seemed like hours, the sun beating down on them as they grappled and swung their weapons. Jack's muscles ached with the effort, but he refused to back down. The warrior, however, was relentless, always pushing forward, always attacking with a cold precision. Jack barely managed to block a blow aimed at his side when the warrior took a step back, seemingly to catch his breath. It was then that Jack noticed something unusual. The warrior's stance, his movement, they were almost familiar. Jack shook his head, trying to clear the thought. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. But then, in one swift motion, the warrior lifted his helmet, and the world seemed to freeze. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the face of the warrior was revealed. It wasn't the face of a man at all. It was the face of a woman. A beautiful, fierce woman with dark, stormy eyes that locked onto his with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. Jack's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He had fought a woman who had been skilled enough to take him on in battle. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The warrior wasn't just some fierce Apache fighter. She was something more. She was a force of nature, a warrior in her own right, and she had been hiding in plain sight. The moment felt surreal, like the world had shifted on its axis, and Jack was standing at the center of it all, unsure of what to do next. The woman did not speak, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't an enemy. She was someone who had been forced into a life of violence, someone who had fought to survive just as he had. And yet, there was something in her gaze that hinted at a deeper connection, something that transcended the boundaries of their cultures, their histories, and their very identities. Jack didn't know what to say. He had never felt so conflicted. On one hand, he was a cowboy, a man of the West, someone who had grown up in a world where the Apache were enemies. But on the other hand, this woman, this warrior, had just shown him that the lines between good and bad, friend and foe, were not as clear as he had once believed. As they stood there, the wind swirling around them, Jack felt an unspoken understanding begin to form between them. This was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of something far more complicated, far more dangerous, than either of them could have imagined. The silence that followed the revelation hung in the air like a heavy fog. Jack stood there, his breath still coming in ragged gasps as he processed the woman's identity. The fierce Apache warrior, who had fought him so skillfully, was now standing before him with her helmet removed, revealing a face that seemed to carry the weight of countless battles. Her dark eyes met his, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade into nothingness. It was as if they were the only two people left in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Neither spoke, the tension between them palpable, but neither of them seemed to know what to say. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had spent years on this land, fighting to survive and keeping to himself. But now, standing before him, was someone who defied every notion he had ever held about the world he lived in. The Apache, his enemies for as long as he could remember, had always been something distant, something to be fought and never understood. Yet, here she was, a woman, and a warrior, standing in front of him, vulnerable in a way that no man ever would be. Her presence, her strength, and the fact that she had kept her identity hidden from him made Jack question everything he knew. He had fought countless battles in his life, but this was different. This was no ordinary fight. She wasn't just an enemy. She was someone who had crossed into his world in a way that was both unexpected and confusing. Her presence stirred something deep inside him, a mix of admiration and something else he couldn't quite name. The woman took a step forward, her hand slowly reaching for the dirt near her feet, as if grounding herself in this moment. The quiet was deafening, and it felt as though time itself had come to a halt. "You do not understand," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "Why I fought you. Why I wore the mask." Jack's brow furrowed as he listened, his gun still hanging loosely by his side. His instincts told him to remain cautious, to be prepared for any threat, but something in her tone made him hesitate. "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice low, but tinged with curiosity. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "I am not your enemy, Jack Brody. I never was. I wore the mask to protect my identity, to protect my people." Jack blinked, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of her words. "Your people?" he asked, the weight of the question sinking in. She nodded. "The Apache are not all savages. We have our own code, our own way of life. But we are constantly hunted, pushed off our land, forced to fight for survival. I wore the mask to blend in, to keep my true self hidden from those who would try to destroy us." Jack took a step back, still processing everything she had said. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had spent his entire life seeing the Apache as his enemy. But what if they weren't so different after all? What if they, too, were just trying to survive in a world that seemed to offer no place for them? The woman, noticing his silence, spoke again. "I was sent here on a mission, Jack. A mission that has nothing to do with you. But when I saw you, I knew there was something more to this." Her voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if she were revealing a secret she wasn't sure she was ready to share. "You have something that could change everything. Something that could shift the balance of power in this land." Jack's mind spun as he tried to keep up with her words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. "I can't explain everything now, but trust me when I say that we are connected, Jack. Our fates are tied together in ways you don't yet understand." The words hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Jack swallowed hard, his instincts telling him to walk away, to forget this encounter and return to his simple, solitary life. But something in her gaze, something in the way she held herself, made him stay. "So what now?" he asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. She met his gaze, her lips curving into a small, enigmatic smile. "Now," she said, "we figure out what happens next." The wind had begun to pick up again, swirling around Jack and the Apache woman like an invisible force, pushing them together in a way neither of them had anticipated. Jack stood in silence, his eyes locked onto hers, trying to make sense of everything she had just said. The connection between them, the unspoken bond, felt stronger with each passing second. But what did it all mean? Was this truly fate, or was it just the heat of the moment that clouded his judgment? The woman, sensing his hesitation, took a small step back, her posture still tense but softer now, less defensive. "I understand your confusion, Jack. You've spent your life on this land, defending it, protecting it. It's not easy to accept that everything you believed in might be a lie." She spoke with a quiet strength, a calmness that had somehow become a part of her, something that had been forged in the fires of countless battles. Jack's gaze softened. "I don't know what to think. My whole life, the Apache were the enemy. We fought, we killed, we lost. I was raised to believe that it was us against them. But you—" He trailed off, his voice thick with the weight of his words. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. I know. I know what you've been taught. I know how you've been raised to see us. But not everything is as it seems. The Apache people are not the monsters you've been told about. We have our reasons, just as you have yours. We are not just warriors, Jack. We are survivors. She paused for a moment, looking at him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. And so are you. Jack felt a tightness in his chest as he processed her words. He had never considered the possibility that the Apache were anything more than what he had been taught. It had always been about survival, about winning, about conquering. But here, in front of him, was someone who had lived through their own struggles, their own battles, and who had found a way to survive, just like him. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. What happens now? Jack asked, his voice quieter now, almost tentative. The woman met his gaze, her eyes full of quiet resolve. Now, we work together. You and I. We help each other. Jack frowned slightly, confused. Help each other? How? The woman's lips curled into a small, almost playful smile. You've been fighting the wrong enemy, Jack. All this time, you've been battling the wrong people. The real battle is not between you and me, or between our people. It's with those who seek to destroy us both. Jack's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? She looked around them, as if scanning the horizon for danger, before turning back to him. There are forces at play here, Jack. Forces that are far more dangerous than any one tribe or one man. I need your help to stop them. Jack stared at her, disbelief still heavy in his chest. He had fought to protect his land, his cattle, and his way of life. But this was something completely different. A partnership with an Apache woman, the very person he had been taught to fear. I don't know, he said, his voice low. I've spent my whole life fighting against people like you. The woman's expression softened. I know, Jack. I know it's hard to let go of everything you've been taught. But sometimes, we have to make hard choices. We have to let go of old grudges and work together to survive. There was a long silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jack felt as though he were standing on the edge of something monumental, something that could change the course of his life forever. He had always believed that he was alone in this fight. But now, standing in front of this woman, he felt a strange pull, something he couldn't explain, something he had never felt before. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What do we need to do? The woman smiled, a look of determination in her eyes. We fight back. Together. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Jack found himself standing at the edge of his ranch, looking out at the vast expanse of land that had been his home for as long as he could remember. The wind carried the scent of the earth, the smell of dry grass and dust, and for the first time, it felt different. It was as if the land was calling him to do something he had never considered before. Beside him stood the Apache woman, her presence as steady and calm as ever. She had not left the night before, and neither had Jack. They had talked, shared stories, and in the quiet of the night, they had forged an unspoken bond. But now, with the morning light, things felt different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that they were running out of time. The Apache woman turned to him, her eyes focused, determined. We need to move quickly, she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of concern. The people I've been warning you about are closer than we think. Jack nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known something was coming, something bigger than either of them, but he hadn't fully understood the danger. How much time do we have? He asked, his voice tight. Not much, she replied, her gaze scanning the horizon. They've been tracking us, watching every move. They know we're here now, and they won't stop until they get what they want. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle over land or cattle. This was something deeper, something that threatened not just his way of life, but everything he had fought for. What exactly are we up against? Jack asked, his mind racing. The Apache woman turned to face him fully, her expression serious. There are men out there who don't care about borders, about the law, or about the people who live here. They want power, control, and they will stop at nothing to get it. They've already taken too much from us. Jack clenched his fists, the anger rising within him. He had spent his entire life fighting for his land, for his future, and now it felt like that future was slipping away. He wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. What do you need me to do? He asked, his voice low and determined. The Apache woman met his gaze, Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. We need to work together. We need to fight back, but we can't do it alone. We need the strength of your people, your neighbors, and anyone who is willing to stand with us. Jack's mind raced as he considered her words. He had lived his whole life on his own, trusting only himself, but now, with the stakes higher than ever, he realized that working alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to build something bigger. How do we get them to help? Jack asked. The Apache woman's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Leave that to me, she said. We have allies in places you wouldn't expect. The question is whether you're willing to trust me and them. Jack hesitated for a moment, his instincts at war with his growing sense of urgency. Trust wasn't something he gave easily, especially not to someone who had been his enemy not long ago. But the world was changing, and if he wanted to protect everything he cared about, he would have to change with it. All right, he said finally, his voice steady. Let's do it. The Apache woman nodded, her expression softening for just a moment. Good, she said. We'll need to move quickly. There's no time to waste. Together, they set off toward the nearby town, where Jack hoped to rally enough support to stand against the growing threat. As they rode, Jack couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a battle for land. This was a fight for survival, and it would take everything he had to protect the life he had built. The journey would be long, and the stakes would be high, but Jack was ready. He had never faced a challenge like this before, but with the Apache woman by his side, he knew they had a chance. The only question now was whether the people he had once called enemies would become allies, or if they would all fall to the same fate that awaited them all. The town was quieter than usual when Jack and the Apache woman arrived, the streets empty except for a few people going about their business. Jack had lived here long enough to know the faces of the townsfolk, but today, there was a strange air of tension hanging over everything. The usual chatter, the clinking of spurs, and the sound of boots on dusty ground had been replaced by a heavy silence. Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. As they rode into town, the Apache woman kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of calm determination. She had said they would find allies, but Jack wasn't so sure. He had never been the one to ask for help, and certainly not from the people who had once seen him as just another outsider, a stranger in their land. But things had changed, and Jack had come to realize that without unity, none of them would survive what was coming. Where do we start? Jack asked, glancing over at the Apache woman. She didn't reply immediately, her gaze scanning the town square as if searching for something, or someone. Finally, she turned to him, her voice low but firm. We start with the ones who know what it's like to fight for something. The ones who have nothing left to lose. Jack nodded, understanding. He knew the type she meant. The outcasts, the people who had been pushed aside by society, those who had fought and lost, and now had nowhere to go but forward. As they dismounted, Jack could feel eyes on them, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A few townspeople had stopped what they were doing to watch, and Jack couldn't help but wonder what they saw when they looked at him and the Apache woman. To them, he must have looked like a fool, standing with the very people he had once been taught to fear. But Jack didn't care anymore. Not when the stakes were this high. They made their way to the small saloon at the far end of town, the building worn and weathered by time. The door creaked as they entered, and the bartender, a stout man with a thick mustache, glanced up from his work. His eyes flickered with recognition before he quickly looked away. Jack could feel the tension in the air, but he pushed it aside. He had come here for a reason, and he wasn't about to turn back now. The Apache woman walked up to the bar, her presence commanding the room as always. She didn't speak immediately, but the way she held herself, the confidence, the strength, was enough to make the bartender pause. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. What can I get you? He asked, his voice low. She turned to Jack, her gaze soft but insistent. Tell him what we need. Jack hesitated, but then he squared his shoulders. This wasn't the time to second-guess himself. We need to talk to the ones who can help us, he said, his voice steady, though it carried the weight of their mission. The bartender studied him for a moment before nodding, a reluctant acknowledgement of the unspoken tension between them. I know who you're looking for, he said quietly. But they don't come out for just anyone. Jack felt his frustration building, but he held it in check. I'm not here for anyone. I'm here for my land. my people, and for anyone willing to stand with us. The Apache woman stood beside him, her silent support giving him the courage to press on. The bartender's expression softened, just slightly. All right, he said, after a long pause. There's a few who still remember what it's like to fight. They might listen. With that, he turned and disappeared into the back of the saloon. Jack and the Apache woman exchanged a look, the weight of their shared purpose settling between them. They didn't have time to waste. The world outside was shifting, and they could feel the storm on the horizon. Moments later, the bartender returned with a few familiar faces, a group of men and women who had once been regulars in the town, now living on the fringes. The man in the front, a grizzled cowboy named Willard, looked at Jack with cautious eyes. "What's this all about?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. Jack looked at the group, his heart pounding. "We're facing something bigger than any of us, something that will destroy everything if we don't stand together. I need your help." Willard studied him for a moment, then glanced over at the Apache woman, who stood quietly by Jack's side. "You're asking for a lot," he said, his tone skeptical. "Why should we trust you, or her?" Jack met his gaze, unflinching. "Because if we don't work together, we all lose. This isn't about who you trust or where you come from. This is about surviving the storm that's coming." Willard's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, there was silence. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said gruffly. "We'll help, but we need to move fast." Words already spreading. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, but there was no time to celebrate. They still had a long road ahead. The fight wasn't over, and the real battle was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. The small group of townsfolk who had agreed to stand with Jack gathered in the saloon, their faces drawn and tired, each of them carrying their own burdens. The Apache woman remained a silent presence, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the anxious energy of the others. Jack felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for his land, but for the people who had come together in a desperate hope for survival. Willard and the others had agreed to help, but the weight of their decision was clear in their eyes. It wasn't just about standing up for what was right anymore. It was about survival, plain and simple. "We need to move fast," Jack said, his voice carrying the gravity of the situation. "The enemy is closing in. We can't wait for them to make the first move." Willard, sitting at the edge of the table with his weathered face, nodded slowly. "You're right. Word's already spreading. They know we're gathering here. We need to make sure we strike first, and we need to do it right." The room fell quiet, as everyone processed the weight of his words. There was no turning back now. Jack had spent his life in this town, on this land, and the idea of losing it to outsiders who saw nothing but power and control was more than he could bear. The Apache woman spoke then, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "You cannot win this battle through force alone," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "You must use the land to your advantage. Draw them out. Make them come to you." Jack met her gaze, feeling the tension in his chest. "We know the land, but they have numbers. We're outmatched in every way." She shook her head. "Numbers are not everything. It's about knowing the terrain, understanding where to strike, where to retreat. They may have more men, but we have something they don't, a connection to the land itself." Jack considered her words, feeling the weight of her wisdom. He had always thought of the land as something to be protected, something to be fought for, but never as something that could fight for them. The more he thought about it, the more he realized she was right. They could use the terrain to their advantage, set traps, and create diversions. The key was to be one step ahead. As the meeting went on, they devised a plan. It was dangerous, but it was their best chance. They would need to move quickly and silently, setting up their defenses and making sure the enemy never saw them coming. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the risks, about what was at stake. This wasn't just about protecting his ranch anymore. This was about protecting everything he had ever known, everything he had ever cared about. The night before the battle, Jack stood alone outside, staring out at the land that had been his home. The stars above shone brightly, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. But it didn't last. He knew what was coming. The Apache woman joined him, standing quietly by his side. They didn't speak at first, but there was a shared understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of the coming conflict. Finally, she spoke. "You've lived here your whole life. This land is part of you, Jack. But you must understand, this is bigger than just your land. It's about the future. Jack nodded, though the words stung. He knew she was right. I'm not ready to lose it, he said quietly, the weight of the future pressing down on him. None of us are, she replied. But sometimes, in order to protect what we love, we must be willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The next morning, they set their plan into motion. The small group moved under the cover of dawn, carefully positioning themselves around the outskirts of the town. The air was thick with tension, but Jack could feel the strength of his allies beside him. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future, for something worth protecting. As the enemy approached, the first shots rang out, and the battle began. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he moved with the Apache woman, using the terrain to their advantage, leading the charge. The enemy was disoriented, unsure of where the attack was coming from. They had underestimated Jack and his allies. It was clear now, this was their land, their home, and they would fight to the last breath to protect it. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air, but Jack didn't hesitate. He moved with purpose, with a clear goal in mind. This battle wasn't just about winning, it was about survival. And with every shot, with every move they made, they were one step closer to victory. The sound of gunfire echoed across the plains, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and dust. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he moved through the chaos, his mind focused on the one thing that mattered, survival. The battle was raging on all sides, but the tide was slowly turning in their favor. Thanks to the Apache woman's plan, the enemy had been thrown off balance, disoriented by the traps they had set, and their numbers were beginning to dwindle. Jack could see Willard and the others holding their ground, moving with practiced efficiency, as if they had been fighting together for years. But even with the advantage, Jack knew this wasn't over. The enemy was strong, and they wouldn't give up easily. He had to keep pushing forward, keep fighting. As he moved through the thick of the battle, Jack caught sight of the Apache woman. She was a force to be reckoned with, her every move precise, calculated, and deadly. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a leader, and Jack found himself relying on her instincts more than his own. Together, they made a formidable team. The Apache woman turned to Jack, her face set in a determined mask. "We need to push them back," she said, her voice carrying above the noise of the battle. "If we don't, they'll regroup and come at us harder." Jack nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. He could see it in her eyes. She was right. This was their chance to finish this. He shouted to Willard and the others, signaling them to follow his lead. They moved as one, charging toward the enemy with renewed determination. The battle intensified as they closed the gap, the sound of hooves and gunshots filling the air. Jack's heart raced as they fought side by side, the dust swirling around them like a storm. But in the midst of the chaos, Jack couldn't help but notice how well they were working together. The Apache woman, with her sharp instincts, guiding them through every move, every counterattack. She was a warrior, but more than that, she was a strategist. And Jack was beginning to realize that he had underestimated her. As they pushed forward, Jack caught sight of the enemy's leader. He was a tall man, clad in dark armor, his face obscured by a helmet, but his eyes burned with fury as he surveyed the battlefield. Jack could feel the tension rising in the air as he locked eyes with the man. This was it, the final showdown. The enemy leader raised his hand, signaling for his men to regroup. Jack knew this was their chance. He pushed forward, his rifle steady in his hands as he closed in on the man. But just as he was about to fire, something unexpected happened. The enemy leader removed his helmet, and Jack froze. It wasn't the face he had expected. It was a woman's face, fierce and unyielding, with eyes that burned with a fire he had never seen before. She was the true leader of the enemy, and Jack realized in that moment that this battle had never been just about land or power. It had always been about something deeper, about survival, about honor, and about the choices people made when faced with impossible odds. The woman's gaze locked onto Jack's, and for a brief moment, there was silence between them. Then, with a swift motion, she raised her weapon and aimed it directly at him. Jack's heart stopped, but before he could react, the Apache woman moved in front of him, her body a shield between him and the enemy. The two women stood facing each other, their weapons drawn, ready to fight. But neither moved. Jack's mind raced as he watched them, caught between the two forces. This was more than just a battle. It was a moment of reckoning, where everything he had ever believed about the world was being challenged. The Apache woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You need to make a choice, Jack," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This fight is not just about us. It's about the future of all our people. Will you fight for what you believe in, or will you stand by and let it all be destroyed?" Jack looked at her, and then at the woman in front of him. He felt the weight of her words sink into him, a realization that the world he had once known was changing, and with it, the choices he would have to make. There was no turning back now. The future was in his hands, and it was up to him to decide what kind of world he wanted to fight for. With a deep breath, Jack made his choice. He turned to the Apache woman and nodded. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady and resolute. And in that moment, the battle took on a new meaning. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing for something greater. Together, they would fight to the end, for their land, for their people, and for a future where they could all live in peace. The battle raged on as Jack and the Apache woman led their group through the chaos, their movements in perfect sync, a well-coordinated force amidst the destruction. The gunfire echoed, the ground trembled under the weight of hooves, and the air was thick with smoke, but Jack felt a strange calm settling over him. He had made his choice, and now there was no turning back. He was fighting not just for his land, but for the future of everyone around him. The Apache woman fought with a grace and precision that was almost otherworldly, her every move calculated and deliberate. She was more than just a warrior. She was a strategist, and Jack was beginning to see that she had a deeper understanding of this battle than anyone else. They fought side by side, covering each other's blind spots, anticipating each other's moves, and pushing forward, step by step, with unwavering determination. Jack had never felt more alive. He had fought before, but this time it was different. This time, there was something personal at stake, something bigger than land or cattle. This time, it was about honor, survival, and the future of everything he had worked for. As the battle raged on, Jack noticed a shift in the enemy's movements. The confusion, the disarray, they were beginning to falter. They were no longer the well-organized force that had first come against them. The tide was turning. Jack knew they had a chance, but there was no time to waste. He turned to the Apache woman, who was still in the thick of the fight, her face set in a mask of concentration. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice hoarse from the exertion. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing with focus. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But we have to be careful. If we push too hard, we risk losing everything." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. They couldn't afford to get reckless. They had to end this, but they had to do it right. With a firm grip on his rifle, Jack charged forward, leading the charge. The others followed suit, a wave of fighters pushing the enemy back, forcing them into retreat. The battlefield was chaotic, but Jack felt a sense of purpose driving him forward. He was no longer just a cowboy fighting for his land. He was part of something bigger, something that could change the course of everything. As they closed in on the enemy's remaining forces, Jack spotted the enemy leader, the woman who had revealed herself to be the true mastermind behind the attack. She was surrounded by a small group of loyal soldiers, but it was clear that she was losing control. Jack and the Apache woman approached, their movements synchronized as they closed in on their target. She stood tall, her face a mask of defiance, but Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had underestimated them. "It's over," Jack called out, his voice steady. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, but she didn't back down. "You think this is over?" she sneered. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning." Jack stepped forward, his rifle aimed at her chest. "No," he said calmly. "This is where it ends." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a final defiant glare, the enemy leader dropped her weapon, signaling the end of the battle. The remaining soldiers, seeing their leaders surrender, hesitated, then began to retreat. The tide had truly turned. Jack stood there, his heart racing, his body sore from the battle, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. It was over. For now. The Apache woman stood beside him, her gaze scanning the battlefield. "You did well," she said, her voice quiet but filled with respect. Jack nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We did well," he corrected. She looked at him, her expression softening for a brief moment. "Yes, we did." As the dust settled and the sound of gunfire faded into the distance, Jack looked out over the battlefield, taking. In the aftermath, they had won, but at what cost? The land was scarred, the people were weary, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time, Jack felt a sense of hope. They had fought for something bigger than themselves, and together, they had triumphed. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was a victory. And for Jack, that was enough for now. The days after the battle were quieter than Jack had expected. The smoke had cleared, but the weight of the victory still hung heavy in the air. He stood on the porch of his ranch, looking out over the land he had fought so hard to protect. The morning sun bathed the plains in a warm golden light, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to relax. He had won, but the cost was high. The battle had taken its toll on both sides, and while the enemy had been driven back, Jack knew that the war was far from over. There would be more fights, more challenges, and more sacrifices to make. But for now, he had earned this moment of peace. The Apache woman stood beside him, her gaze scanning the horizon as always. They hadn't spoken much since the battle, but the silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding of the journey they had just been through. "You know," Jack said, his voice breaking the stillness, "I never thought it would come to this. I never thought I'd be standing here with you, fighting side by side." She turned to him, her expression soft but thoughtful. "Neither did I," she replied quietly. "But sometimes, things change. People change." Jack nodded, understanding. He had spent his entire life believing in a certain way of life, a certain way of seeing the world. But in the end, he had learned that the lines between good and evil, right and wrong, were not as clear as he had once thought. The Apache woman had taught him that. They had fought together, trusted each other, and in the process, had become something more than just allies. They had become partners. "What now?" Jack asked, looking at her. "What happens next?" She smiled slightly, her eyes reflecting a depth of wisdom. "Now we rebuild. We heal. But we also stay vigilant. The fight is not over. It never truly ends." Jack knew she was right. The world around them was constantly shifting, and there would always be forces that sought to tear things down, to control what others had built. But they had survived the first battle, and that gave them hope for the future. "I'll stand with you," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'll stand with you, and with anyone who believes in a better future." The Apache woman nodded, her expression filled with quiet pride. "I know," she said softly, "and that means more than you can understand." The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, life began to return to the land. The people of the town, once divided and uncertain, began to rebuild. The scars of the battle would never fully fade, but they would heal, as all scars do, with time. And as Jack worked alongside the Apache woman and the others, he realized that the land wasn't just something to be fought for. It was something to be nurtured, something to be shared. They weren't just fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for a future, for a chance to live in peace, to build something that would last. The bond between Jack and the Apache woman grew stronger with each passing day. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also seen the best. Together, they were forging a new path, one that didn't rely on division, but on unity. One that didn't see enemies, but allies. As the years went by, Jack and the Apache woman watched as their world slowly transformed. The land they had fought for flourished, and the people, once divided, began to see each other in a new light. Jack had found something he never thought possible: peace. But it wasn't the kind of peace that came from simply surviving. It was the peace that came from understanding, from working together to build something better. And as Jack looked out over the land, with the Apache woman by his side, he knew that the fight they had started was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, but together, they would face them, stronger than ever. And for the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that the future was something worth fighting for.